Hi guys, welcome to another episode of the Armourer's Bench. Today we're going to take a look at a trench mortar. The British Army entered the First World War with very few mortars, and certainly none at the battalion level. As the stalemate of trench warfare set in, and the effectiveness of enemy mortars became clear, it was decided that trench mortars of various sizes would be needed. Nicknamed plum pudding or toffee apple mortars after their projectile's characteristic shape, the 2-inch Medium Mortar was one of Britain's first effective light trench mortars. Trench mortars were the Army's most forward artillery, right up on the front line. These short-range weapons were able to throw large, high-explosive projectiles over short distances across no man's land, towards enemy trench systems opposite. The 2-inch mortar was considered accurate out to 350 yards, with a maximum effective range out to just under 600 yards. Introduced in 1915, the 2-inch mortar was originally crewed by men taken from the battalion it was stationed with, along with specialists from the Royal Artillery. However, with the introduction of the 3-inch Stokes mortar, which was operated by the infantry themselves, the 2-inch mortars became the sole responsibility of the Royal Field Artillery. In its basic form, the mortar is made up of its wooden bed, the tube, its elevating mechanism, ignition system, and projectile. Mortar positions were often in secondary trenches just behind the infantry's front line. This was to help protect the infantry from potential counter-battery fire. The trench mortars were often deployed to sectors to provide counter-battery fire against German Minenwerfers, or in the run-up to an offensive or local action. A British Army report on artillery use, drawn up in February 1917, noted that owing to their liability to be destroyed by hostile artillery fire, it may often be advisable to defer opening fire with these mortars to the last day of bombardment. The mortars were also tasked with keeping gaps made in the wire clear, and with supporting any feint attacks made by the infantry during gaps in the bombardment running up to a larger offensive. Llewellyn Wynne Griffith, a captain with the 15th Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and later a novelist, recalled in his war memoir, "At night, a trench mortar officer set his guns in a derelict trench about 20 yards behind the line and carried up his ammunition, heavy globes of iron with little cylindrical projections like a broken handle. In the morning I moved the men from the bays between the trench mortars and their target to lighten the risk of loss from retaliatory fire. Sometimes the width of no man's land required saps to be cut, extending out from the front line, so the mortar rounds didn't fall short. The 50-pound lollipop-like projectile had an effective maximum range of 570 yards, depending on the size of the cordite charge used, and could create a crater 5 feet deep and 14 foot wide. The ideal mortar position was a 6 foot wide and 9 foot deep sandbagged pit, with the heavy weapon's wooden bed at the bottom and room for the crew to load the mortar. Crews could manage to fire approximately once every 2 minutes, much slower than the lighter 3-inch Stokes mortar, but faster than the heavy 9.45-inch heavy mortar. The mortar, comprising of just its tube, bed, stand and ignition system, weighed 320 pounds, or 145 kilograms, not including the accompanying tools and the Temple silencer system, which could be fitted. Typically manned by a 5-man mortar crew comprising of an NCO, gunners and ammunition bearers. To operate the 2-inch mortar, a cordite charge was first placed down the tube. The projectile's shaft was then inserted on top of the charge. The projectile's fuse was then set and checked, and a new blank cartridge was chambered in the ignition system. The crew then got clear of the weapon and pulled the lanyard to fire the mortar. To reload, the crew ran a clearing stick down the tube and then repeated the loading process. Interestingly, the 2-inch medium mortar, like the larger heavy mortar, used a cut-down rifle which screwed into the breech end of the mortar tube. This particular mortar has an 1898 dated cut-down Lee Enfield Mark I. The cut-down rifle has a wooden insert in its magazine well, but amusingly it still has its original rear volley sight attached. This reusable system was developed to replace the T-tube friction igniters, which were in high demand for Britain's bigger guns. The Lee Enfield-based system enabled the cordite propellant charges to be ignited by a blank .303 round instead. The rifle's trigger was pulled with a lanyard from cover nearby. These cut-down igniter rifles are sometimes mistakenly thought to be Obrez-style Lee Enfields, possibly used by miners, but in fact they were actually used to fire off mortars. The size of the cordite charge dictated the range, and it used a variety of different fuses which screwed into the nose of the bomb. The mortar was aimed by lifting the tube and aligning its support with the range markings on the outside of the tube. The sphere was about 9.3 inches in diameter, with a 2-inch thick thread for the fuse at its head, and a cup for the 22-inch long, 2-inch thick solid cast iron stick or spigot at its base. The cast iron sphere itself was filled with either amatol or ammonol explosive. The mortars were often deployed in batteries of 4, with 3 Royal Field Artillery medium mortar batteries attached to each division. The mortars were predominantly tasked with cutting enemy barbed wire and destroying enemy trenches and forward positions, such as machine gun nests. In his memoir, Captain Griffith described a battery of 2-inch mortars opening fire on enemy lines. A pop, and then a black ball went soaring up, spinning round as it went through the air slowly. More pops, and more queer birds against the sky. A stutter of terrific detonations seemed to shake the air and the ground. Sandbags and bits of timber sailed up into the air and then fell in a calm, deliberate way. And in the silence that followed the explosions, an angry voice called out in English across no man's land, "You bloody Welsh murderers." The 2-inch medium mortar entered service in spring 1915 and remained in use with British and Empire troops into 1917. It was used on both the Western Front and in Mesopotamia. Over 800 mortars and 675,000 bombs were ordered initially. Many of the mortars were made in railway and agricultural machinery workshops. This allowed the larger factories to focus on more complex weapons. The 2-inch mortar was eventually superseded by the larger bore Newton 6-inch mortar, which fired a similar size projectile. Thanks for watching, guys. It's not every day that you get to take a look at a trench mortar. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you'd like to know more, check out our accompanying blog over at www.armourersbench.com. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Sharing the video with friends really helps the channel to grow. If you'd like to support us, please consider checking out our Patreon. Tab is an entirely viewer-supported project, and your help is very much appreciated. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.